We'd like to thank the following sponsors for helping provide this video.
Kanban, Myths and Misconceptions, and our speaker is Frank Vega. Very glad to have him. He's in town giving a couple private courses and agreed to talk to us, share some of his over 25 years experience in IT and IS, and the fact that he's been involved with Kanban since 2007. So he has a lot of knowledge and experience. He's spoken at many conferences, given courses on it, and collaborates with the leading Kanban thought leaders in the country and around the world. So we're very pleased to introduce Frank Vega. And welcome, Frank, and we'll switch laptops.
I feel like I'm in an Agile Denver presentation. There's so many similarities, except we don't have 3 screens and a great videographer right up front here. So you guys have a few things that I'd like to see in our group as well. First of all, thanks, David, for that. Where's David? Did he already leave? Thanks for that introduction. And thanks, Jean, too, for your persistence in getting me this opportunity to speak. I know we've been talking about it for some time now. And we finally got the stars to align, as you said, with my schedule. So great, I'm glad to be here. So let me see if I got this on here. So first of all, in addition to the introduction that Dave gave me and that you saw on the website that I presented or provided for you earlier, as I said, this really feels like an Agile Denver meeting to me. I spent a lot of time with this group in Denver. It's very much an Agile New England, except in Denver. I started attending that group, I was telling some of you earlier, when it was the XP users group way back when, and then somewhere around 2002 they shifted over to Agile Denver. And in 2004, I really began to get much more involved and started to volunteer. And when you do that, then you get into a situation where you become a board member. So about 3 years ago, we did the official paperwork, and we became a nonprofit. And I was part of the initial board. And we also started doing a one-day conference. We call it Mile High Agile. And we started that about 3 years ago. And we've sold out 450 seats for 3 years in a row. And so we're going to do a 4th. So obviously there's a demand for that. So I hear you guys do something similar, right? Something similar, good. What's your turnout? Is it 400 or so, or a little smaller? A little smaller. Speaking of turnouts, is this the smallest turnout you guys have seen in a while? I'm just curious. So some of the other groups besides Agile Denver, actually I'm just stepping off as a board member as per our bylaws to make some room for some new thinkers. And, but I'm also involved with this group here, the Agile Denver Kanban SIG. It's a group that I started about 2.5 years ago. And it kind of serves the purpose as your earlier 101s. It's a place for somebody to go and talk a little bit more specifically about a topic that they're interested in instead of maybe some of the broader topics that they get at the main presentations. Okay, and that's going well. That's also affiliated with this group here, the Limited Whip Society. Is anybody familiar with the Limited Whip Society? Okay, so that's a broader group, and they're trying to get more and more groups like this SIG here. And like, for example, you have one called the Limited Whip Boston. Is AJ here? Did he make it? I don't think so. But there's probably about 6 of these types of chapters around the country. There's many more in Europe, believe it or not. The Europeans have moved a lot faster in adopting the Kanban method, for example. So there's many more of these types of groups actually in Europe. I'm also part of the Kanban Coaching Professionals group, which is a group of accredited trainers and coaches, accredited by LKU, Lean and Kanban University, which is the organization run by David Anderson. And we'll talk a little bit about him here in just a minute. On that note, we had the conference, the Lean and Kanban Conference in Chicago 2013. We have another one coming up in 2014. Did anyone go to the one in Boston in 2012? Just one of you, huh? Okay, good. A few more. Good. Because in your backyard, it's a great opportunity. And so I think that covers all of them. So to show you just how similar we are, here's my opening slide that I typically do when I do a presentation at Agile Denver. So when I saw your questions, Dave, I said, oh, there you go. I've got all my questions already answered, so we can kind of skip through there. So it's good to see. I always like to ask how many first-timers we have here, just to get an idea if it's the topic, because that gives an idea then that maybe we need to look at that topic again sometime in the future. So just one more time, how many people do we have first time? Okay. All right, good. And so the question I ask, is it the topic? Or is it just because you thought this is the day you want to get out and see what Agile New is looking like? Okay. For some of you, I think I talked to you a bit, and you said, hey, the topic is interesting, something new for us that we're interested in. Okay. All right. So I won't go through all the rest, because I think David covered just about all of them that I can think of. Oh, one important one. How many of you are here and are not part of software development or not part of IT in terms of the function that your company performs, that you perform? Okay. Fantastic. I always hope that at least one hand goes up. And my wife says, what are you going to do when no hands go up? So I do have something in my back pocket when no hands go up. But to me, that's important to understand too, because I think what we're going to be talking about is myths and misconceptions about the Kanban method tonight. And one of those myths we're going to talk about is this idea that it's only for software development. So obviously I'd like to, at some point in time, hear why you're here if you're not primarily in software development, in terms of why the Kanban method might be of interest to you. Okay. So on that note, I just want to remind people as well, I do have a lot of Slack built into my presentation tonight, so if you do have questions as we go along and they're pertinent to the slide or next slide we're going to be talking to, please feel free to go ahead and ask your question. If it's something that's going to come down a little bit further down the road, I might defer it a little bit. If it's something that's a little out of scope, maybe we'll defer it to the end, but please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Okay? So the caveat I always start before I give a presentation to is I'm not here to give you a silver bullet, an answer to all your questions, or the answer to your big burning question. All I'm here to do is really just give you some insights maybe to a new tool that you might be able to use to get to what I like to say, get to some better questions faster, okay, some more effective questions. I expect this presentation to be like nothing else I've done before, because typically I try to tweak it as I hear the questions that come up and try to go in that different direction. All right, so part of your responsibility is to ask those questions as well, so we can make this unique and as valuable as possible for you all, okay? And as I said, I'll listen to adapt, and I expect to learn too from your questions and the insights that you share, okay? So as I said, this presentation is one that I gave at Lean and Kanban North America 2013 in Chicago. So for you, and for those who I give it to afterwards, I say, here's my taste to you of Chicago, just a small taste of that conference, since many of you couldn't make it. The significance of the picture, too, is a memory of that conference is my first ever taste of an authentic Chicago-style deep dish pizza. If you haven't had one, please do. It's everything they say it is, and more, okay? All right. So the title of my talk is Kanban Myths and Misconceptions. And I want to talk about each of those words here in just a minute before we go on, because I want to make sure we're on the same page. But first of all, I gave this presentation as part of the Foundations track there. And you might be wondering, why would you give a Myths and Misconceptions presentation at a Foundation track where people are just learning about it? You're going to see why. But beforehand, let's make sure we get on the same page with this term, Kanban. Okay? So tonight, when I say Kanban, I'm not talking about the basic definition of a signboard or a visual card. Okay, that is one definition of the word Kanban. But it's an overloaded term, like interface, okay, if you're a software developer. That's not what we're going to be talking about tonight, although it does have it plays a role in the Kanban method, okay? And I'm not talking about Kanban, the word that's used to identify one type of pull system, all right? Obviously, a pull system has a major role in the Kanban method, but when I use that word, that's not what I'm talking about. And the reason why I'm saying this is a lot of times, I think people, when they hear somebody talk about Kanban, they don't take a minute to understand whether they're talking about the visual card, about the pull system, or about the method. And so I want to get clear on that. And that's where I think some of the myths and misconceptions get started, because we're talking about two different or three different things. Okay? Tonight we're talking about, when I say Kanban, I may not always say Kanban method. We're talking about the Kanban method, and in our community we typically refer to it as Big K, Big Kanban. Okay? And it's typically the method that's described primarily in this book here initially by David J. Anderson. He wrote this book a few years back, and as you can imagine with the book, a lot of the information was actually collected prior to 2010, so by the time the book comes out, already parts of it are dated, right? We know about big batches, right, and large inventory, and the reason why you want to do that. So I always tell people, certainly start there because it's a good collection of a lot of information related to Kanban. But definitely look at the blogs, look at the posts, get involved with your special interest groups and these other communities to get the latest and where we're at with the Kanban method. Because I started, as David said earlier, I started with it in 2007 after somebody heard about it at Agile 2007. I think it was in DC. And it's amazing to me just how much the Kanban method has been tweaked over that time as we continue to improve it and learn how to articulate it a little bit better. Okay? So big K. So tonight, when I use the word myth, I want you to focus on this word invented, all right? An invented story or idea. And when I say misconception, the key word here is erroneous. Erroneous notion. So tonight we're going to be talking about the invented and erroneous notions or concepts that people have about the Kanban method that I think prohibit maybe them utilizing or getting the benefit of the method to its fullest. Okay? So I mentioned earlier that, excuse me, that I did this presentation at the Kanban Foundations track. And yes, why would you do that? Why would you start somebody off talking about myths and misconceptions? So these quotes here, in my mind, set the stage for why it's important to understand, as we are beginning to learn something new, how myths and misconceptions play a role in our learning. Okay? So I'm going to give you a second to read that and take my first opportunity to get a quick sip of water. Okay, so as we learn something new, obviously, as a natural response, we begin to invent, or excuse me, create images of this new learning based on past experiences, right? Or maybe some guesses of what we are hearing for the first time. All right? So there's nothing wrong with us developing these images initially. That's, I think, a perfectly natural response. But it's this second quote down here that I think we need to really recognize and remember from time to time. Not only do we invent them, but we actually start to respond to those invented images about this new learning. And there's really nothing wrong about that unless you forget that sometimes you invented those images, and so they may not all be accurate just yet, all right? So just remember these two things as you learn something new. It's not that it's a bad thing, it's just we have to be conscious of it. Now, we actually started talking about myths and misconceptions about, in this case, Lean and Kanban, at Boston in 2012. If you attended, you might have caught this presentation by Jeff Patton. Okay? But we found ourselves still talking about myths and misconceptions later that year in San Diego at the Kanban Leadership Retreat, when about 20 or so of us, leaders and practitioners and coaches in the Kanban community, got together. We were amazed at how many still myths and misconceptions we were starting to hear about the method. And we thought, you know, we have to do something about this. Maybe we can start talking about them and see if we can help, you know, curb where people are going with some of these ideas. So hence the presentation, okay? So if there's one thing tonight that you get out of this presentation, and I hope you get more than one thing, maybe 2 or 3, but if there's one thing, it's this concept here, this idea here. Don't let myths and misconceptions about the Kanban method limit your unique learning of what it is and how it's to be applied, okay? So, as I said, we normally don't get that big of a turnout at Agile Denver at our presentation, so I brought like 30 or 40 of these handouts. I don't know if they're still out there, so obviously not enough is what I'm saying. But don't worry, I'm going digital. I try to go digital as much as possible. And that reminds me, I'll get a PDF of the slides so that you can distribute them. Yeah. And if you go to this slide here, you'll see the URL, and you can get this PDF if you want, and see maybe another longer list of the myths and misconceptions that I have here. So on one side, we do have the principles and the practices, and we'll go over those here in just a minute. And here's 10 of those myths and misconceptions that we identified at the leadership retreat. Now, I'm not going to go over each one of these, and you really can't read them from here. That's why the handout, but sorry, I didn't get enough. But I do want to go over 3 important ones, I think. And the reason why I think they're important is I think they're foundational. I think if you get these right, if you understand that these are myths and misconceptions, you will start to see the rest of these and many others that you're probably already hearing, why those are myths and misconceptions as well, okay? And then maybe you don't have to deal with so many, but think about these 3 first, and you can go from there, all right? Okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is the erroneous and invented notion that the Kanban method is the Kanban method is a software development method. And the way I hear this often expressed when I'm listening to people talk about the Kanban method, I'm doing a tutorial or just listening, listening in a conversation, is I hear things like this. Since we switched to Kanban from whatever methodology they're using, we don't do this or we don't do that. And the key word that I'm listening for is switch. Because the Kanban method is not a software development method. It is not your workflow process. So you shouldn't be saying things like, I switched from to, okay. And if you are, what I'd like you to do is to maybe take a different perspective. Okay. So again, here's the principles, and just very quickly, I'm not going to read them to you, but just very quickly look at them. As you can see, they're very non-prescriptive. And there's nothing there that limits itself to IT or software development. Okay. Here are the core practices, there's 6 of them. And as you can see, they're a little bit more prescriptive than the principles, as they should be, right? Because they're practices. But relative to a software development methodology that you know, these are pretty non-prescriptive. And in fact, nothing here that limits itself or suggests that it's just IT or software development, okay? So if you're looking at the if you're looking at the Kanban method from a software development perspective or lens, it's going to look like this picture here. You're going to see things that you think make sense, or that you recognize, I should say, but they don't make sense, right? You see this young lady sitting in an empty pool, and she has this cascading water running in her back, or a plastic sheet. It just doesn't make sense, all right? So if you change your perspective, though, like this quote here suggests, and you change your point of view, you begin to see something different about the Kanban method. It looks a little like this picture here. So look at it from a lens, for example, as a process improvement lens, all right? And now that same picture starts to make more sense. You see the young lady's really sitting at a field pool, holding herself in a horizontal position, and you say, ah, now I get it, or the light turns on, hopefully, okay? And you realize saying things like, I'm switching from to the Kanban method don't make sense anymore, or not as much sense anymore, okay? So if you continue to look at it through software development lens, or you hear somebody else continue to do that, it's going to look like this duck. And they're going to say, I see a duck, but that duck doesn't fly, and it doesn't walk, and it doesn't quack very well. And I would say, well, yeah, because the Kanban method is not a software development method, okay? It doesn't replace your software development process or any workflow process. It's a different type of tool, okay? I'm getting a few smiles out there. I'm not sure if I'm hitting anything, but if you want to comment as you're smiling, let me know. Go ahead and contribute as well, too. So I do encourage if not a question, a shared experience, or that would be fine, too. Okay? All right, so that was the first myth and misconception. The second major one that I want to talk about is this one here. Has everybody heard this one? Has anybody not heard this one? So okay, so one person had, okay, a couple. So most of you have heard this one. A few more.
I didn't.
Go ahead.
I didn't hear this. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense? For example, that they're saying things like the Kanban method is just Scrum with. You're saying no.
No, it cannot be.
Nobody in their right mind would say that. Is that what you said? I love that. I love that. Nobody in the right mind would say this. All right. So you don't agree. You don't agree is what you're saying. Fantastic. Well, let's talk about this. And actually, we're going to dig into this one a little deeper. Oh, I'm sorry.
I've heard it almost the opposite. So I've actually never heard this either. I've heard the opposite, which is, well, Kanban's okay, but you got to add a couple of Scrum stuff to it to make it work.
Yes.
That's what I hear a lot.
That makes more sense to me. At least that's in my mind makes more sense. And then if you just add another twist to it and say it's a different type of tool, and so that makes more sense to me. Whereas the other way around, I think, is going to be more limiting. We're going to see a few slides. Thanks for adding that. Okay. The other reason why I encourage questions is it gives me a chance to get another sip of water. Okay, so let's talk about this one. And even if you don't ask questions, I built in slides to give you a chance to get a sip of water. Because anybody knows when you do a presentation and all you're doing is talking, it gets really hard after a while. You're not physical dry. So here's another set of quotes. And I think these are important because they set the stage for this myth and misconception and how we're going to talk about it here in just a minute. So I'm going to put down my mic again. Please take a second to read these and I'll get a quick drink. I'm still thinking about those two statements. You got to be out of your mind, and it's okay, but you got to add something. I got to remember those two. Okay. First of all, let me give credit for these quotes and where they come from. Does anybody know Stephen Spears? You guys got to know Stephen Spears. He's in your backyard. Okay, so I think he teaches at MIT at the business school. And he presented last year. Did you catch him, Sean? Yeah. He presented last year at LKNA 2012 in Boston. And he gave his book out, The High Velocity Edge, to everybody. And so if you haven't heard of it, you probably haven't seen it. But take a look at this book if you can. And you don't have to read the whole book, but at least read chapter 1. And I think you'll get a lot of valuable insights in what these quotes are trying to say. Okay, so all these quotes come from chapter 1. They're scattered about, but I put them on this one slide here because I think together they are very important about talking about this next myth and misconception. In particular, well, the first one sets the stage. When people sometimes say, you know, we are using the same tool as someone else, but we're not getting the same benefits, it's these other two parts that you're really missing. It's because you really never understood that it's not the tool, it's the learning that goes around the use of that tool. It's the discovery process that goes into using that tool, not just the tool itself, okay? So, yes, if you're observing somebody who's doing, let's say, a Scrum methodology, and they have said we're using the Kanban method, and at some point in time, you see that they're not doing, let's say, a time box anymore, or they're not doing an iteration or an estimation anymore. Don't stop there, though. And that's just the observation of the after effect of them using the tool. Ask them questions. You know, continue diving into it, as Stephen Spears would suggest, and ask them, what problem was the time box causing you? Okay, first of all, you want to know what was the motivation for looking at something different? And why did you look at the Kanban method? And how did the Kanban method move you in a different direction from using the time box? Don't just say, oh, okay, I see them not using the time box anymore, so Kanban must be Scrum without a time box. Okay, Kanban method must be Scrum without a time box. Okay, dig deeper. And then you'll start to do what Stephen Spears is saying. You'll start to really appreciate what they're doing with the tool, and then you have a better chance of getting maybe some of the benefits that they were getting. So once again, that's why I start off with the first myth and misconception. It doesn't replace anything. It adds to it a learning tool, a knowledge creation tool. Okay? All right. Because if you still keep thinking the other way, yes, you're absolutely right. It will not be a sufficient software development methodology. It could be. It can't be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this one, a little bit more from my own personal experience, because I can talk about my why with time boxes and iterations, okay? And I can tell you how the Kanban method helped us, and then you can see how we use it as a learning and a knowledge creation tool, not just something to replace what we were already doing, okay? So, in theory, by the time we started using the Kanban method, our team was a pretty disciplined XP team, okay? Any XPers out there currently? I don't see enough XPer hands anymore. I wonder what's happening. What's happening. But we were a very disciplined XP team, and so we had made some great strides in improving our code, reducing our defects, getting our quality up. We had made some great strides in learning how to deliver, so to speak, on a regular basis. All right, but we still had some issues. And one of the issues was with this time box in theory. Okay, is in theory you have these uniform fixed length intervals, and you're trying to get a certain amount of work to fall within that uniform fixed length. Okay. And you also have quite a number of your workflow activities occurring at the boundaries of those intervals, all right? Well, in our process, it didn't work out as nicely as that. We often had a situation like this where the work exceeded that interval, okay? Or we underestimated so much, or overestimated, depending on your perspective, and we had so much space left over in that interval. And the point I'm trying to make is we spent a lot of energy and a lot of effort trying to fit things into that fixed uniform time box, okay? Now, I'm not suggesting you just go and get rid of it. If you don't have a problem, you don't have a problem. We had a problem in that we were spending a significant amount of time trying to do that. If you're not, your context is different, that's fine. Our context didn't allow us to do that, we thought, easily. And we thought maybe there's a different way. So about that time, we started to hear about the Kanban method, as you saw from those practices earlier, one of those things was measuring and managing flow. And that was very interesting to us. And so we started to dig into what measuring and managing flow meant, some of the models that others were using to help them implement that practice in their context. Okay? And we found out that we could replace those fixed uniform time boxes with a small set of variable length intervals and associated probabilities for each, okay, that would tell us what we should see or what we'll expect to fall into those intervals based on measuring our system over time. So it looks a little more like this. So this table up here is essentially a frequency table. Okay? And as you can see from the top line, after we measured our system for a short period of time, and when I say short period, I don't mean like months, I mean like a few weeks, it was amazing to us how if we followed the same policies, which is also one of those practices we talked about earlier, if we would make our policies explicit and make the team aware of it so everybody was following these policies on a consistent basis, we found in a very short period of time actually that most of our work items, in this case I'm talking about something like at the story level, most of our work items, or I should say a large number of our work items, 27% would fall into this interval of 1 day. Okay? Another 27% would fall into this interval of about 2 to 4 days. Okay? And another interval would be about 5 to 7, and that was about 20%. And then another interval of about 8 to 14 and 17%. And then we had these other things too. And these other things were different though. We'll talk about that. And so the point I'm trying to make is we stopped doing a lot of upfront, quote unquote, estimating and time boxing, if you will, and just simply made our policies explicit, started measuring the system, and we found out if we follow those policies, the work items would go through the workflow at about this rate, and it stayed consistent over time for the most part. Yes?
Were these percentages? Yeah, were these percentages, did you have these percentages available as you were doing the project, or you only knew this data after the fact?
So when we started to move to this way of working, we didn't have the percentages, and so we started just measuring, and within probably 4 to 6 weeks, we started to see these numbers stabilize, and then over time, we realized they didn't move a whole lot. Okay, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it stabilized while you were working.
Over time, yeah. And of course, you have variation in the system, and so when you first start measuring the system, you're going to have natural variation, but over time, when these numbers start to get, your N gets large, so to speak, these numbers don't shift a whole lot. Now, they did shift from time to time over a long period of time, but we could usually see the effect of certain activities that might have caused those things. But overall, if you look at the first quarter, and then all the 3 quarters, and then the overall statistics, there's not that much variation, except for when somebody, quote unquote, tampered with the system, and then, yeah, it went a little haywire. Okay, I got a question. Oh, Mike's over there.
Yeah, what do you mean by policies, or can you give me an example of policy?
Yeah. So one of the policies, for example, as I said, we were a very XP team. And so one of our policies was we encouraged, I don't want to say force, we encouraged pairing, for example. So let's talk about how that policy might keep a work item like a story small. So everybody familiar with pairing? At least familiar enough so that you know what I'm talking about. And so, for example, in an environment where you're not pairing, and I'm working on that story, and then somebody comes in and says, Frank, I have a, we call it a distraction. It could have been an HR distraction. It could have been I had to go do an interview. It could have been somebody needing me on another project. So in a non-pairing fashion, that story would go idle. It'd go into delay mode. In a pairing fashion, Frank would, all right, paired programming eliminated. Fantastic. I can't hide my XP bias. I have to admit it. I can't hide it. So in a pairing fashion, though, Frank would get distracted, but his pair would keep working on that story. So can you see how if one of our policies was pairing, and you can see why many of those stories then, over 54% of them, were done in 4 calendar days or less, because somebody, once that story was pulled, somebody was always working on it. And the probability of both of us getting pulled off was lower. It was lower because we had pairing. Yeah.
So are you saying that at the beginning, you didn't estimate it, but you tracked how long it took, and you said how many are, 1, 4, 7, 14, and then over time, you then estimated?
You had the first part dead on.
Okay, all right.
So we were trying to do what I call upfront estimating or deterministic thinking, if you will. And in our context, we had difficulty doing that, and we had to spend a lot of time doing it, and we just felt that maybe we could spend that time doing other things. So what we did is we started employing a measurement tactic. Okay. So for the first few weeks, you're right, we're flying a little in the dark because we don't have any information. So what I do when I coach teams, for example, I don't say abandon your estimation. What I say is, if that's what you got, that's what you got. But then you might look at measuring, and so we have an overlap. In our case, we weren't getting any value really from it, and so we thought the benefit of just ditching it was greater than to keep trying to do it simultaneously. So yes, in the beginning, I had nothing. We just started measuring. But the surprising thing is, at least for me, in my opinion, within 4 to 6 weeks, I had numbers that as I was saying earlier, were relatively stable over time.
Meaning if you did that again, how long it was going to take? What do you mean by stable?
Meaning is I continued to add to the data set, those numbers didn't vary a whole lot. So as N became big, those numbers became more stable. Now, if you're an analyst, the first thing you might say is, yeah, but you might have periods where you have variability. Absolutely. So I had the overall count, but I also took snapshots in time. So as I said earlier, I know when somebody tampered with the system because the snapshot would vary greatly from the overall picture. And we could look back and point to what we did or what somebody did to tamper the system, and almost always tie it back to, yes, that would increase variability. So for example, just to use this as an example, let's say somebody said, we're not going to pair this month. We didn't do that, but had somebody said that, I bet you I'd be willing to bet that you would have seen some more variability in the lead times of your work items going through the flow. Okay? Okay, good question.
I see you use the term lead time there. Sometimes there's confusion about lead time versus cycle time.
Yeah.
So would you please define exactly what you mean by
Absolutely.
lead time?
That's a great question. When I start my tutorials, Tom will tell you, I spend I make sure that I cover that immediately. So remember I said overloaded terms? My background is technical, so I'm a developer. I love the word interface because there's at least 5 different meanings with that. And as a developer, you know what somebody means, but you really have to be clear about that. The community is starting to use the term lead time now and trying to stay away from cycle time. However, because cycle time is so prevalent out there, outside of our context, software development, we almost always know that it's the same thing, but it's not. Yes, that's what I'm saying, but it's not. What I mean is, we're using it the same way, but we know others don't. So, in my context, for my presentation tonight, when I say lead time, I mean from the point that we quote-unquote pull it to the point that we don't have influence over it anymore, which we call done. Okay. Now, if you want to add a definition to what cycle time is, I'd rather not because I think it confuses the discussion, but I'm more than happy if you want to take a shot. Okay, good. But thanks for bringing that up. So yes, I'm using it from the time we pull it to the time we lose influence over it. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Go ahead.
And you're only talking about the time that the developer programmer has it, not QA or.
Good question. No, in my context, I'm talking about the influence that my team has over it. So my team would have product owners on it. My team would have testers on it. My team would have developers on it. We didn't have VAs for the most part. We had product owners that did most of what a VA would do. But I do coach and work with teams that have VAs. They would be on it. It's typically after the business says this is what we want, and then they put it in a backlog. When we pull it from that backlog, at that point, our to-do starts. Their to-do started when they started talking about it, but our to-do starts, and then we start tracking it. Okay. So if you were going to do this for a longer system, yes, your to-do would go upstream and further downstream. So remember I told you earlier, these are story-level work items. We also track epic or feature-level work items, and then somebody might track release-type items, or initiatives is another thing that's very common and popular. Okay?
Right, I have a question. Just assuming that, first of all, it's the same team, right, and it's a pretty experienced team. That's question one.
Okay.
And question two is, it's also assumed that you're doing the same type of work over and over and over.
So the first thing I have to tell you is I have a whip limit of 1 on questions that I can remember. So I might have to ask you the second one.
Right.
So yes, this data is for a development group, and my development group consisted of multiple teams. So the size of the teams were anywhere from 5 to 10. The group was probably 20 to 30 developers when I collected this data. Does that help? And the second question?
Second question is. That's right. Second question is.
I'll repeat.
Regarding the same type of work.
Oh, great question. Great question. Is this the same type of work? Yeah. For the most part, it is the same type of work. For example, this is coming out of the structural engineering domain. So all of these epics, if you will, that we're pulling and breaking into work, to story work items, if you will, were all relatively the same type of work. I mean, it included UI and included back-end stuff too, but it's all in the same domain, if that is close enough. It's all structural engineering. So it wasn't like our teams did, this domain and that domain. I think that might be a little bit more domain specific.
I got one more question, if you don't mind. Right, in regards to learning and training, how does that fit into your perspective, your program?
Help me understand the question part there.
All right, so if someone comes to you with a requirement or a task, right, and you don't have the expertise on your team to do that, right?
Oh, okay.
How do you fit that into your lead time?
Okay, so if again, we're talking about one single domain.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, absolutely. So I think the question was, what if somebody brings you something that your team's not familiar with, and you might have more learning to do rather than just, start coding on it right away? So in our context, I don't know if I have the situation you're talking about. Like I said, the domain was pretty much the same thing, structural engineering. I'm trying to think of an example though. So there might have been something that the team pulled that they needed a SME or a subject matter expert for. But more often than not, after a couple of, I would say, iterations on the stories that came out of that feature, the learning curve was taken care of. So we didn't really have probably the issue you're talking about. There wasn't like something came down the road that was completely new for us. So the variation maybe wouldn't be as apparent in my data that might be in yours. So how would you account for that? If your system continually has that coming, where your team always has this new learning thing going on, your data is still going to stabilize, in my opinion. At some point in time, though, you might see over time a spike in the variation due to the learning, and I bet you can point back to that spike in the variation when you look at the data as to being that's the point where we pulled this new epic that nobody was familiar with. So, but if you're always doing that, then that's just the norm for your system. But if it's just an occasional thing, I'm pretty sure you'd see the spike in the data. I'm going to show you a chart in just a minute. I think it'll be very clear what I'm talking about. Okay? Okay. Very good. All right. I was looking around here because it's a good sized group and you guys are spread out. So, all right. So that's the same data set, and the only reason I'm showing this, and we're not going to go deep into the metrics part here. I'm just showing you it's the same data set visualized in different ways, so somebody can see very quickly. Not everybody can grasp that from looking at the table, but you can see very quickly. Yes, most of our items are in this ballpark here, and that's up to 1 day, 2 to 4, and then it tapers off here. Okay. Here's the other chart I was talking about. Same data, but this is another tool that we use, same data. So it's not like I'm doing a lot of work. The same data set feeds all these charts and they all just pop up once I put in the new data set. But you can see the variation here at this point in time in the graph. In your situation, you might be able to point back and go, oh yeah, that's when we pulled the XYZ epic, and we've never done that before. Okay, I know what happened there. We didn't have an XYZ epic, but that's what I'm sure would happen in your situation, where all of a sudden stories took a little longer than we anticipated. Well, what happened? Well, XYZ we'd never worked on before. Now that goes into your data set. If you get another XYZ, I bet you it won't be as high, but you might still see a little bit of a spread. And then over time, if you keep getting those same XYZs, they'll just normalize. That's based on my experience. That's
At what point were you assigning T-shirt sizes to various different stories?
That's a great question. So yeah, I didn't know if everybody picked up on that. So these are coming from that histogram, and we use this to T-shirt size. we would T-shirt size. In our situation, we pulled from a backlog of epics. We didn't take an epic and create this full release backlog. I don't know if anybody's still doing that anymore, but we had a small backlog. In other words, like 9 epics. Some people call them, you can have initiatives and then features. We would pull that epic, and as soon as we pull that epic, we had a equivalent of 1 on the epic size for a team. Then we would break down that epic into stories, and at that point, we would use this data to help us say, is this a small, medium, and a large? Okay. And an extra large. But we never let an extra large go through the system intentionally. We had policies that said, if you think that's an extra large, you put it in the backlog, but as soon as you pull it, the first thing you do is a spike on it and break it down, okay? Does that help a little bit? So to round this one up, oh, I'm sorry.
Is there any difference at all in the way you would treat a new feature development, like an epic or a defect that the team has to work on?
Do we treat them differently?
Yeah, anything in what you mentioned so far?
Okay, I can take a moment to talk about defects. That's a little, as I said, a little out of the scope here for what I have, but I'll take a moment and then I want to get back on track. Obviously, an epic we treat it differently than a defect. An epic would be a big piece of work that we would break down into multiple stories. Okay. Now, when you say defect, it's kind of interesting because when I first went to work for this company before we were quote-unquote agile, we would do we would do a release every 12 months with a 3 to 6 month firefight and several patches, right? By the time we got back, I can laugh now, but not then. By the time we got to where we were, we didn't have a bug tracking system. I know I say that sometimes, and people look at me like I'm on Mars. We got rid of the bug tracking system. That's how good the quality got. And I'm serious, we could count our bugs on one hand. And when I say bugs, I mean bugs that required an immediate. So if something, we call that escaped in the wild, if something escaped in the wild, that was serious, it came right back into the workflow immediately, it was fixed, and a subsequent release went out. Okay? If we found something before it got into the wild, that was a good thing. It just simply got fixed. Just it went through the workflow once again, it got fixed. Okay? Okay. I'm going to try to be mindful for time, so I will watch the questions just a little bit, but I think we're doing okay. So the last thing I want to say is just kind of to wrap this one up is it's not about getting rid of, it's about adding to and replacing. Think about it more that way. So we didn't just get rid of estimating and said we don't do estimating anymore. We replaced it with what you can see are some, in my mind, more useful metrics in our context, right? That were easier to generate and collect. We spent less time, and they gave us more value. It was an easy choice to make. Okay. Same with the iterations and the fixed time box. I want to talk about iterations specifically for just a minute because I've had people come up to me and say, you know, we tried Kanban, Frank, but we want to develop in an iterative way. So we went back. And I said, there's nothing in Kanban that says you can't develop in an iterative way. Nothing at all. Just because you get rid of quote-unquote a fixed time box interval doesn't mean you don't develop your stories in an iterative manner. Okay? So for me, the definition of iterate is not a fixed uniform time box. You know, that's what we typically hear people call iteration. To me, iterate means this. Something goes through the workflow. Sometimes it goes all the way through. We most definitely and frequently get feedback that goes back into the workflow, either in the form of the story goes through a second time or maybe a new story. Okay? So that's, I would say, expand your concept of what iteration and iterative development means. It's not just this fixed time box. Okay? And the last thing I'll say on this one, well, one more than last, is we also took the activities that we typically used to do at the boundaries of those intervals, those fixed timed intervals, and we decoupled them. Now, when I first heard this, I didn't understand what that really meant. What that means is, for example, the acceptance review, which we call the reveal or a demo, we kept that on a fixed 2-week cadence. Why? Because it worked very well for the external stakeholders to fit on their calendar, right? It's much easier to do that for them. But now we didn't try to fit things in the quote-unquote those 2-week boxes anymore. And from a development perspective, we just pulled just in time and using more of just this Kanban way of working, okay, a full system, okay? Same with retrospectives. We stopped doing them every 2 weeks arbitrarily. We did more of a stop the line. If something was an issue, we stopped the line and fixed it. Or we would look at our backlog, and if we didn't have any process improvement items in the backlog, that was our Kanban for having another retrospective, okay? The last slide on this one, and we'll move on to the third one, then I'll open it up again for more questions. The reason why I like this is I've had these conversations time and time again with individuals, and this individual, Paul, who I'm working with recently in an engagement, I could see his eyes kind of light up, and he summarized it, I thought, very well. He says, I get it. When you remove this artificial time box concept, if you will, you replace it with learning about your system. And those metrics, we're learning about our system rather than trying to figure out how we can estimate what goes into a fixed uniform time box. I think he said it perfectly, okay? All right, the final, I think, significant myth and misconception that is helpful to understand out there is this third one. And I often hear people describe the Kanban method sometimes in this way, and this is where I recognize it. When they say something like, we've seen the Kanban method, or I'm observing people using the Kanban method, and from what I can tell, it's best suited for command and control, or it's best suited for complicated work, or what they call ordered work, as opposed to unordered or complex work. Or it's best suited for bug fixes and operations and maintenance. Can't possibly be used for new product development, which is ironic, I think, or interesting, I should say, to me, because the first time we used it was for new feature development. I never used it simply for bug fixes or maintenance, which is interesting. So once again, because it's been a while since I had a sip of water, I have some quotes though that set the stage for this next myth and misconception. So I'll give you a chance to read these, and then I'm going to take a quick sip and we'll go forward. How many have heard the first one? I think just about everybody's heard the first one. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. How can anything be wrong and still be useful? I'm going to show you a good example. Did you have company?
No. Well, the Boyle's gas law, volume increases with temperature.
Yeah.
It really doesn't, but you can do all sorts of useful things with that.
I'll have to take your word for that one, but I heard what you're saying. Yeah, that's example one that I'm not as familiar with, but okay. The second quote, though, I think is maybe even the more important one here, although the first one I think is quite interesting. When we use models to help us make sense of new things that we're learning about, in this example, the Kanban method, which these people are doing, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that part. But we have to remember, as we use these models, it's normal or often the case that we pick out the parts of the model that make sense to us and that we want to see, that support our thinking, all right? And we ignore the rest of the model that we don't really agree with or doesn't support. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's just subconscious. We just ignore that, right? I've seen a few smiles, so I think you know what I'm talking about. But it's the second part of this second quote, I think, that's even more important. We stop talking to people who are making different decisions or choices about the models than we made, okay? And we start making allies of those who see it exactly the way I see it. And I don't know if I said this, but I should have said it at the beginning of my talk. I like to start off by saying the greatest amount of learning occurs at the interface of disagreement. The greatest amount of learning occurs at the interface of disagreement, provided there's constructive dialogue. Okay, I have to add that one in. And in my mind, if you have some concepts about the Kanban method, you really should seek out those who maybe have a different one, not those who have the same one, and have some more conversations with those who are thinking differently. So let's take a look at this one first. How many people have been to London? All right. Oh, wow. A lot of world travelers in here. The first time I went to London was 2007. So those who went to London, you know what I'm talking about, right? You have to ride the tube if you go to London. That's how you get around. Here's a map of the tube. And as you can see down here, a form of this map, not this particular one, has been around for 150 years. Now, I don't know what the tube looked like 150 years ago. And actually, this is a little bit older, dated map. So, but the point being is some style of this map has been around for 150 years. So this the style of map has to be useful to be around for 150 years, right? This form. You don't think so?
No.
I'm sorry?
I mean, I know that the form has changed, but I also know that many things are just imprinted and we keep using them until somebody does away with them entirely. But longevity doesn't necessarily speak to utility.
I agree with you. I mean, I'm not going to argue that. But I would suggest that the reason why this has been around is people find it useful. If you use the tube, and to make my point, if you look at any of the maps in Boston and Denver and Chicago, they all follow this style now. So I'm not, pardon?
This style is relatively recent. I am pretty sure that I remember when it was invented, and it was not 150 years ago.
Okay, I'll have to take your word for it. Now, I've seen some of the older ones from this article that I got this from, and it's not that recent. But, you know, I'm not going to, I'll have to go validate your assertion. So let's assume.
I'll go check, too.
Yeah,
Maybe I'm wrong.
I could be wrong, too. Let's assume, though, that I'm going to take, and like I said, when I went and got this from the blog site, there's many more that are much older than this one here. So anyways, whether it's 150, I know it's been around, this type of map's been around for a long time, and a lot of different cities have adopted it. So what happens, though, when you use something like this, that it's a great model, it's a very useful model, but it's also a wrong model. It's wrong in the sense that the tube doesn't really lay out this way in London, okay? So let's take a look at what happens when you use a model without maybe looking closely at the assumptions and how that model was made, and how you don't look closely at the assumptions you're making as you use the model, okay? So this story I'm going to tell you comes out of a book called Obliquity. Has anybody read Obliquity? Nobody's read Obliquity. One or two. Okay, and the author of Obliquity is a gentleman by the name of John Case, if I'm not mistaken. And I believe this is his own personal story. So John is coming from another city in England, and he's coming to London, and he's going to get off the train, the train that's above ground, not the tube, at Paddington Station. And he's going to get on the tube, and he's going to his friend's house for a party that night. He's going to get off the tube, and he goes to Notting Hill Gate. He gets off the green train or the yellow train and gets onto the red one and goes to Lancaster Gate. There you go. And then he walks the last block or so to his destination of Hyde Park. Okay. And when he gets to Hyde Park, he immediately realizes, oh my gosh, it's been a long time. And he apologizes to his host and he says, sorry, it took so long. I didn't realize the tube was going to take such a long ride. It didn't look that bad on my map, on my tool. And his friends laugh at him and chuckle, and they say, why did you take the tube? I thought you were getting off at Paddington. He says, I did. Later on, he goes and uses a different model. Now, this model is probably a little more accurate in terms of how he actually traveled, but maybe it's not as useful to John, and that's why he didn't use it. And he realizes he actually went all the way from Paddington Station out here to Notting Hill Gate, and when he switched trains on the tube, he essentially finds out, for all intents and purposes, he backtracked almost to where he started, and then he realizes that that was his destination, and he could have just walked there maybe another half a block or so if he would have just walked from Paddington instead of using this tool. Okay. So what does this mean? How does this help us? So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because when I hear people talk about the Kanban method and they make statements like, it's only good for command and control. Now, I didn't say it can't be used for command and control, it's the only part that I'm having a little trouble with. Or they say things like, I see complicated and simple here. I don't see a possibility for using it for complex problems or unordered problems. Or I see it only for maintenance. In my mind, they're using models to help them make sense of the Kanban method. They're seeing the parts that they want to see. They're ignoring the parts that they maybe don't want to see. Or they're not talking to others who are seeing it differently. And so they see the KA and the AN part, but they don't see the full part of Kanban. And then they say, it's only useful for command and control, or it's only useful for complicated, or for DevOps and maintenance. Okay? So my suggestion to you, that's okay that you use a model. I think we should use models to help us make sense of new learning. But here's another model that might help you. It's a quad model, just like a lot of these models are. And the author of this one is suggesting that as you use a model, or if you're trying to use a model to help you make sense of something new, is categorize the assumptions in this way. Try to figure out which of your assumptions in your context are most important to get right. try to figure out which ones in your context carry the most risk, okay? Or uncertainty, I should say, all right? And then at least, not all of them, but at least those critical ones, try and test and validate for yourself how that's holding up as you use this model to help you make sense of what it is you're trying to make sense of in using that. So I'm going to talk about one specifically. How many of you heard of Schneider Model? Good. I was going to say, if nobody's heard of Schneider Model here. So the Schneider Model, now I have to admit up front, I have not read the full book on the Schneider Model, but I've read some pretty good overviews and some pretty good summaries of people who I trust and I think read the book completely. And the Schneider Model is a quad model, just like the one I showed you earlier. And I'll see if I can get these right. In the upper right, it's command and control. In the lower right, it's competence. In the lower left, it's cultivation. And in the upper left, it's collaboration. Get those right? Somebody who's familiar with that? Okay. Now, the author of the model, when you read the book or you read some really good summaries of the book, is not suggesting, well, let me put it another way. If you look at it, those on the right are definitely different than those on the left. You can kind of see that. But the author is making no assumption and no assertion that the things on the right are better than or worse than the things on the left. He's simply just saying, here's a model, and if you're going to be doing something in an organization, it might be helpful to figure out the primary cultural traits of that organization and where they fall in this model. And oh, by the way, no organization is going to fall in completely in one quadrant, okay? So just kind of remember that. If you're going to use that model to help you make sense of the Kanban method, you know, try to remember the assumptions of the model, first of all, that none of those, in terms of the model authors, is supposed to be better or worse than the others. So if you're already bringing this idea that some of those are worse than others, it may not be a good alignment for using that model, or at least make an adjustment for that, okay? So let me bring it to an end here, and then I'll open it back up for some more questions. Again, as I said, if there's just one thing that you can take out of here, hopefully you take out a couple more, but it's this idea of don't let myths and misconceptions, now you understand what I'm talking about when I say myths and misconceptions, about the Kanban method, limit your unique learning of what it is and how it's applied. Because if you don't do that, or if you're not aware of that, the myths and misconceptions really aren't going to limit your learning about what it is and your benefit and how effective it can be used, okay? So with that, that's the end of my Kanban myths and misconceptions. I think we're coming up just past the top of the hour, but I don't know if we have a few more minutes for questions. Okay, and there's my contact information if anyone wants to follow up with some emails and or hit my website, but I'm more than happy to take a few more questions and then follow up with questions via email if I don't get to them tonight.
Hi. So I haven't heard you talk much about customer value and feedback. Could you discuss that in the frame of Kanban?
Sure. So just to make sure I heard, you didn't hear me, you said you didn't hear me talk much about customer value and feedback. And that's probably accurate. It's on tape, so I can't deny it, right? But one of the things that the Kanban method does suggest is, in my mind, to measure and manage flow, okay? So if the definition of done for me is the customer accepts it, okay, then if I'm using that as part of my definition, I have to look at some point in time where that acceptance occurs and how it occurs, all right? So the key here is how do you define quote-unquote done? Or how do you find, like for example, the earlier question, when I say lead time, what do you mean by the beginning? What do you mean by the end? Okay. So although it doesn't, I said earlier, although the Kanban method won't explicitly state that, and it's not really going to because it's not quote-unquote a software development tool or product development tool, but it is a workflow tool. So if your definition of done includes customer feedback, which in our context I hope it does, then your lead times are going to be really long unless you do count that, or you're going to have what we call a lot of rework, okay, or bugs in the field, so to speak. And so that's a good point, though. When I do teach, quote-unquote, a metrics class on the Kanban method, you know, I also say, too, just because your lead times are going down and your throughputs are going up, you have to have another metric to balance that, okay? And that other metric is usually quality of some sort. You know, are defects going out at a higher rate? Are customers dissatisfaction going up or down? So, you know, just like in any methodology, an increase in throughput is meaningless unless it's counterbalanced and validated with a different metric as well. Good question. Yeah?
Oh, I agree. Quality is so important. And I also think that business value and cycle time, or lead time, as you call it, is vitally important. But when I'm having conversations sometimes with the developers and the managers, they are so fixated on this velocity and this story point. It's very difficult. I find it very difficult sometimes to get through to them that perhaps that's not really telling us anything.
Yeah.
How do you help make the transition to Kanban and letting go of some of those things and measuring what really is important?
I wish I had another slide up. I'm sure Sean knows which one I'm talking about. So we try to articulate it in this way: value trumps flow. Okay. So we have another data slide, or another slide I should say, that I give in a different presentation. I don't have it in this particular one. But one of the things that we say when you try to apply the Kanban method and this lean way of thinking is it's not just about flow. In fact, that's second. It's value trumps flow. So in other words, if your value delivery is going down and your flow is going up, it's meaningless. Or another way of saying it is, if your flow is going up, but it's not increasing your value, it's meaningless. So we definitely cover that in the introduction. When I introduce the Kanban method to people, it's not about getting flow up, it's about increasing value delivery. Oh, by the way, when you talk about lead time, cutting lead time increases, hopefully, that value delivery, makes it sooner rather than later. And then you mentioned feedback. The faster you get something out, the faster you get that feedback, the faster you can fix it if it's not correct. And then, if it is correct, the faster you can hopefully focus on those more important features. So lead time is important from that standpoint. Any others? I've got a couple. I think this gentleman here. We're going to make David run. And then we have another one back there too. So.
Can you talk a little bit more about what a cadence?
I can repeat the question, I think. You said, can I talk a little bit more about what a cadence is?
Yeah, cadence, and what differentiates that from a time lapse, and what you do with rituals or whatever?
That's a good question. And how does that differ from maybe the notion of a time box, right? Yeah. Okay. So here's one example I can give you that I think shows quite a big difference. So for example, when somebody said to me one time, we tried the Kanban method, but we missed the planning. And we were kind of talking about that earlier up here. No one said to stop the planning. We did change, quote unquote, the cadence of that planning. So instead of doing a planning session, so to speak, every 2 weeks, we did a planning on a different cadence. It was the cadence that we measured and found occurred every 35 days, about plus or minus 7. And that was the cadence of our epic being pulled from the backlog. So we didn't stop doing planning. We also didn't do it on an every 2-week interval arbitrarily. We told people our next planning session will be about 35 days, plus or minus 7. And depending on where we were with the epic, we could project out where it's going to be very close. So we could signal our product owners, for example, it's going to be in about 2 weeks. It's going to be about 2.5 weeks because we knew where we were with the epic. So that's the cadence. We used the cadence of 35 plus or minus 7 for our planning sessions. We used a cadence of 2 weeks for our reveals or our demos to external stakeholders. And our retro was more just in time. Our retrospective was when we finished the backlog items of the previous retro, that was our Kanban or signal for another retro to occur. So that was more just in time as needed. 3 different ways that we were signaling when something was going to occur. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm just trying to square that with the slide with the boxes and the different sizes in the 2 weeks. Like, so you were able to demo something over 2 weeks?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Or you would just start something else and then demo?
We would demo every 2 weeks anything that was in the done column. Done column being we're waiting for acceptance, not done. We had done and we had done. And
done.
So the point I'm trying to make is on some demos they may have seen 5 work items. Other demos they may have seen 3. They never saw 3.5. It was always a done work item. But so in other words, we didn't say that you were always going to see X number. What we said was, on that day, you'll see what's done. But we also had an idea of a throughput that we were capable of. We knew that we typically finished about 1.5 work items per day. So every 2 weeks, you can do the math. We knew about how many work items they were going to see. Okay, does that help a little bit more? I think we had a question up here that I don't want to miss you, and then we'll come over here.
Okay, this is something I think you said this is a myth or misconception, but I've heard it fairly frequently, most recently about an hour ago from John here.
Okay.
We have Scrum and Kanban. We use Scrum for our core development team because it seems to work. We use Kanban for, well, depending on who it is, it's like the support group or somebody that's got a lot of small things coming in fast, and that's the right way to do it. How do you respond to that?
I smile, like what I'm doing right now, and because that's exactly what I'm saying, that people are using a model of manufacturing, event-driven, to fit Kanban in that box and say that's all it's good for, okay? Now, the reason why they do that is because most of the times I hear, we can't use this other methodology because every 2 weeks is too infrequent. These things come up, they're event-driven, they come up immediately. That makes no sense to plan for a bug that we don't know about, right? So what I would say is you can actually use the Kanban method to help you improve both of those workflow processes. And so as I told you earlier, when I actually started using the Kanban method, we didn't even use it for maintenance. We used it for new feature development first. And then I discovered other teams saying, but it's also good for maintenance support. But on the other hand, how many people have maintenance teams separate from their development teams? Okay, I told you earlier I was an XP team. We did our maintenance. So it would come back as a defect right into the loop and got fixed. And that's why we had 5 defects out in the wild kind of account, because I don't want to use this term, but eat your own dog food is what they say. So we produced high quality code because we maintained the defects as well. And we didn't want to, we had a fire team at one time. Does anybody have a fire team to deal with the bugs in the field that are emergencies? Over time, our quality went up. Guess what happened to our fire team? What happens to a fire department when there's no fire? Yeah, they become volunteer fire department, So we retired our fire team by improving our quality. So yes, I hear that all the time, and I would say that's okay, but expand your perspective, change your perspective, and you can use it for new product development too. The reason why I think people use the other methodology for new product development is they think that Kanban has no iterations or no planning, that type of thing, and that's, I think, a misconception. Yes?
You mentioned...
The mic is dead, yes.
No, I was pointing me outside too.
You mentioned that one of your policies was to bring extra large stories, extra large T-shirt size stories into small ones, which makes a lot of sense, and certainly teams working with Scrum would do the same.
Yep.
Which of your policies, aside from cadence, do you find to be significantly different from what, let's say, people who are focused on the rule of a time-boxed way of working and all the associated estimating that goes with it? And why is that bad?
Well, that's a great question. Let me see if I can get it, because there's a lot there. But I think I can summarize it, and then I need to think about it too. Because I'm not sure I agree totally with what you said, but let's see. But you asked me, what's the most important policy that you think, or what policy do I think is most different from maybe what people are currently doing, and why is it significant, similar to that?
Yeah.
Okay. To be honest with you, let me go back to this policy that I just talked about, because I think maybe it's what we did that was different in how we did it. So let me explain what I did, and then you tell me if you see these other teams doing this. Okay. So what I said was, when we pull an epic from the backlog, first of all, we did a time-boxed planning session of 2 hours. Okay. And in 2 hours, we would typically generate 15 to 20 stories that gave us a very good picture of what that epic was. But from that point on, we stopped doing any more story development. So I don't know if those other teams do that, but we stopped. We didn't say, wait a minute, there's still more stories to this epic. We're going to develop those and size them all and Okay, we didn't do that. So that's one thing that we did that's probably different than these other teams you're talking about. We stopped at 2 hours or 15 to 20 stories, whichever came first. Because at that point, we said, we have enough information, or this is the best we're going to get. Any more time on this is probably not as, remember the law of diminishing returns? Okay. Now, that means that some of those stories went into the backlog as extra large because we couldn't agree at the time how to break them down, or we hit the 15 mark and we knew we had more work to do. So when we pulled that story, we also had a spike associated with it so that we could track the work. And the spike basically was work on it another hour or two, get your hands, knee deep, so to speak, and your task is to break it down into the more reasonable stories. Okay. So I don't know if the other teams are actually working on that, doing it that way. I think it's different. So the difference in summary is I call that just-in-time planning. We did the 2 hour time box planning, like that looks very similar probably to these other teams, but the rest of the work, the rest of the planning that occurred on the epic was done throughout the work of the epic just in time. And that's a very different concept that most other teams probably are not employing in a pool method. Just in time is very important in a pool way of working. Okay? Okay, yes?
Have you tried measuring the flow through of value as opposed to the flow through of work hours? And if so, any hints?
No. Yes and no is to your question. And the reason I smile on that one is we always came back to the business. You guys have been here, right? You guys have been there. That's why you're asking the question. Are you on the business side or the development side?
Development side.
Development side. That's why you're asking the question. The question always was, how long is it going to take? And we didn't really know. And we would sometimes ask the business, well, how valuable it is. Well, we don't know until how long is it going to take. I mean, it was a circular kind of thing. To be honest with you, and I'm just going to be honest with you, we were a pretty darn good XP team. I have yet to see a context that is very good at measuring value up front, which is why I'm a big fan of not only XP, but Lean Startup way of thinking. And Lean Startup way of thinking is the things that are going through the workflow have nothing to do with producing ROI in terms of the customer. It's on obtaining knowledge and information to validate that this thing is even worth building in the first place. So what I would suggest to people, I have teams that say, we're just thinking about getting into Agile, and I'm like, my gosh, Agile's been around a long time, XP team's been around a long time. Now, it's not just about building something fast, it's about making sure you don't build the wrong thing fast. And I'm saying, you better catch up quick because there's some good teams out there that have already moved on, and they're answering the value question first before they build it, just like we should be writing the test before we write the code. They've already figured out that problem, and their solution is to think in a lean startup fashion. That's my answer. I see David here, so I think he means let's wrap it up.
Thank you very much, Mike.